Welcome back. This is our third lesson in criticism. We're focused on rhetorical criticism, and these are the lessons on the criticism part of that. We're going to get to the rhetoric eventually, but right now we're going to open up this third question, or the third aspect of this lesson, which is how do we do criticism? That is to say, this world of rhetorical critics. How is that going to work for us? And we're going to look at how rhetorical criticism fits into the larger community of communication studies. We also said before we were going to take a look at, this third lesson would bring us back. We're going to take another look at the way theory and methods interact with each other, and we'll get to all of that in this lesson. But first, before we go down that road, let's pause here and do a quick review of our lesson 2, which was focused on the scope and the arena of criticism, the different kinds of criticism. We opened up and we said science was one kind of criticism, and that science set out to explore nature, that it was quantitative. It wanted to give a quantitative description of the material aspects that are present out there in the world of nature, and that it was dominated by method. Science basically has a unified method. There's only one method across all of science. It's universalized. It seems to apply to all of nature. It's accumulative. Once you've learned something in the scientific method, you don't have to go back and repeat those opening studies before you can move ahead. You can take what has been established and you can move from that forward. You don't have to keep duplicating those studies. And last but not least, most powerfully, science was self-correcting, which was phenomenal. Okay, and the arts set out to do something different. They're not trying to describe nature. They're trying to represent or to represent, to show again some quality of what it means to be human. So we're trying to represent qualitative aspects of the human experience. Now, for us, methods are very different from the method of science. For openers, obviously, we have more than one method, plural, methods. So our methods are diversified. There are many of those methods. They're very particular, we found out. That is, they're going to differ from one subfield to the next. The kind of methodological study, the kind of criticism that you're going to do of a painting or of a sculpture will be different from the kind of criticism we bring to a political argument or to a novel. So our methods are very, very diverse, and they are tailored usually for the aspects of the arts that we focus on. Our methods are also non-accumulative. Every artist, and for that matter, every critic has to make their own mistakes. They've got to make their own discoveries. They've got to find their own way through this, and that means that our methods are most certainly not self-correcting. We live in a very messy methodological world. The arts don't have a method that will fix it if you get it wrong. We can do things wrong in the arts. We can make mistakes in the arts, and those mistakes can stay with us for a long time until somebody comes along and shakes us up a little bit. So the methods here are not self-correcting, and they depend to a very, very large degree, frankly, on the insight and the experience and the skill of the artist and the critic, both. We also mentioned there are two very broad areas of the arts. We talked about the plastic arts and the performing arts. The plastic arts produce an object, a thing that we are going to contemplate, look at, study carefully, whereas the performing arts produce an event that we're going to focus on and contemplate and consider. The plastic arts, we said, they take something like stone or metal or the colors in paint, and they basically take those and rearrange them. But in that rearrangement, they somehow transform them. The very stuff the object is made out of in some way becomes transformed, transubstantiated into an entirely different thing, a statement about human experience. Over in the performing arts, there's not a thing per se exactly that we transfigure or transform in this way. What gets transformed or transubstantiated actually in the performing arts is time. We go and we sit down in a movie, and for the 2 hours of that movie, we're somewhere else. We're in a different universe, or we're in a different time, or we're with different people in a different kind of experience. So our very time gets transformed in those experiences down inside the arts. and that's one of the things that that marks the performing arts. And of course, we are in the performing arts to a large degree, and we said there are a lot of things going on in the performing arts. There is, for example, the world of dance is out there. The world of drama is in the performing arts. You also have the world of music. That's part of the performing arts. And then you come, of course, to the verbal arts, the arts of speech, where words are the medium that we are essentially using in order to shape and craft and direct some kind of human experience, a feeling, a thought, an idea, a conclusion, a response to the world. So those are the basic subdivisions inside the performing arts. Now, a question has come up, which is essentially like, well, okay, wait a minute. Where's philosophy? Where's history? Where's theology? These are all religious studies. These are all aspects of the arts. They are, in fact, aspects of the arts. It's one of the reasons we sometimes call the arts the humanities, because we study that human experience and reflection in all of those areas too. The word art, techne in Greek, just simply meant an area where you could study in a way to create a pattern, a discipline for learning. So obviously, the history, philosophy, all of that is inside the world of the humanities, inside the world of the arts and letters. We sometimes say letters referencing the people who study and reflect in written texts. So all of that fits into our category of arts. They don't fit comfortably into the plastic or the performing arts, and there's they have their own wing inside the humanities that we can talk about. But as I said, it's messy. In fact, as we move ahead here, we're going to draw lines that we're going to turn around and have to erase, right? I mean, it's just not going to be as tidy as a lot of the organized, ordered sciences. But we're going to turn our attention now to how we make our reasoned judgments inside this world of human reflection, human experience. How is it that we ourselves are going to do criticism? And we've said that, particularly in regard to the verbal arts, we generally formulate our patterns. We think about how we put this together about two very specific areas. And those areas are content and delivery. Now, those are two broad categories, and they're really, as I said, we're going to draw lines and we're going to turn around and erase them. They're kind of catch-alls, right? Content and delivery basically focus on, in terms of content, we're looking at how something is structured, how it's put together, how is it ordered. So we pick up this idea of the text itself, the artifact itself. We look at that carefully. In the world of delivery, we look at other aspects, like how the thing is presented to us, where the audience is, and so forth. And so we'll look at each of those in just a moment here, just very briefly. In essence, when you pick up this idea of content, you're looking at the parts. We said that once you have a method, that method shows you essentially how the system is organized here, right? It will show you that here's your artifact, and this is where it's trying to take you. It's trying to bring you to this conclusion over here. So that's your thesis. That's your primary focus. And, it's got 1, 2, 3 different ways that it's going to give you to think about how you should get to this thesis that we want you to embrace and to think about. That's the content. We'll look at the introduction. Did the introduction get set up nicely? Did it draw the audience in? What about the line of reasoning in these main points or these main ideas? Each of them provides us with a path to get over here to this conclusion. And then we look at the conclusion itself. Did the conclusion make a strong appeal? How was it tied together? How well did it flow? What were the transitions between each of the points? Did they make sense? That's the kind of thing that we do when we begin to examine the content of a rhetorical artifact. Now, obviously, content will vary. Here we're thinking of a pretty traditional presentation, editorial, political speech, something like that. But obviously, if you're looking at a scene out of a movie, or you're looking at a monument that has been erected, the World War II monument that was put up in Washington, D.C. These are things you can go to and you can look at, and of course we're going to ask the same kinds of questions. What are the parts? How are the parts related to each other? How does one move from one part to the other? How's it ordered? How's it arranged? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are many, many other aspects to this. But that's our primary focus when we think of content. We think of what are the parts here? How's it all put together? And even when you've got an artifact like a monument or a scene from a movie, we ask very similar questions at this point. What's in there? What are the parts of it? And how are those parts related? In delivery, we have a similar thing in terms of having a very broad general idea. We talk about, again, in the traditional idea of a presentation that we watch, say a speech at a political convention. Then we ask things about gestures, right? What kind of gestures are there? What were the facial expressions that were there? This is a famous painting of Plato over here on your left, who I just framed out there, and Aristotle over on the right, and they're having their famous discussion and debate. Movement, where do the people move around or do they stay fixed? Delivery also in this day and age raises questions about the medium or the media itself. What is it that was how was this message delivered? Is this on a blog, or is it in a large national newspaper, or is it one scene out of a 2-hour-long movie, or is it a closing chapter of a novel? So what's going on here in terms of the way this message got to its audience? And for that matter, who's the audience? One of the things that we will focus on is the context of the artifact. When was it done? Where was it done? Who was the audience that seems to be most likely to have responded to this and to have been moved by this kind of a message? So all of that would be coming up in terms of this very general idea of delivery here when we break things down into content and delivery. So those two frame out for us a good, let's just say a nice handle that we can pick up and work with and work forward with. We will be back to those in a good bit more depth and detail. But the important thing to notice at this point is that when you are looking at content and when you're looking at delivery, both of those have to be done with a disciplined, careful, reflective method. It's the method that will draw together our exploration of the content and the delivery of the rhetorical artifact that we're looking at. So that's where we want to begin to think about and turn our attention. So we're coming full circle now back to the idea of method. Just to remind ourselves, a method is basically just a set of instructions for exploring this rhetorical artifact. It's going to provide some kind of information or understanding about how that rhetorical artifact functions, right? The parts, the pieces, the relationships, and the people they were appealing to, the kind of audience that we would have expected. And the results of that method don't stand alone. Once we apply the method and we get this information or this understanding, this sort of outline of the how the message functions, that's just the beginning. Once we have that, we have to then interpret that those results. And that interpretation is basically the judgment we're going to make about this communication in this event. And so communication. It's all communication at this point. And that brings us to the fact that when we step into the world of communication studies, we're looking basically at exploring the communication phenomena from several different angles. And for us, we generally will group the world of communication studies into three very different approaches to understanding the communication phenomena. Now, it's not to say that these are that one of these is right and the others are wrong. They're just looking at different aspects, different ideas of the communication event. And we want to take a look at each one of these major divisions of communication methods. So there's the quantitative, there's the qualitative, and there's the rhetorical. Quantitative methods basically are methods that try their very best to imitate as much as they can. They want to mimic the scientific process. with as much overlap as possible. So there's a lot of statistics, and they work, as science does, with quantities. And of course, they work from experiment. They do controlled experiments. Now, the experiments, the observations, the testing that goes on in quantitative methods is limited. And we're very happy about that, because the subject of the experimentation is the human being, and we don't want to give anybody free range on the kind of experiments they can perform on humans. That's not a good idea at all. So basically, the quantitative methods will be the methods that go out, and their conclusions are going to be based on measurable data from a controlled setting. They're going to tabulate everything. They're going to report numerical results. And what they're looking for, communication scholars who do quantitative studies, they're looking for the composition and reaction, that should sound familiar, to specific variables within specific communication settings. That's the quantitative method. Not the method that we do, and not the method that we're going to be focusing on, obviously, here. Qualitative methodologies, they're another group. The qualitative method explores what's happening very much at an experiential, kind of a gut, sometimes even a subconscious level inside a communication event. Now, in qualitative studies, what we do is we go out, we distribute questionnaires. Qualitative studies will have, particularly with regard to studying and analyzing their questionnaires, looking at focus groups and in-depth interviews. They'll do these things. That's sort of their methodological approach. But then they'll take those the results from that. They'll tabulate them. They'll see how many times they got similar answers. So it's very much it sort of touches base with that strict quantitative approach, but it goes beyond it to try and also see what's going on very specifically and very particularly in communication events and experiences in their natural setting. So as much as possible, the qualitative researcher wants to see research done in the context of real-life communication events that are out there. So this will get them into ethnography and autoethnography. The researcher goes out to the communication phenomena, and they want to make their notes and their observations and everything there. They will report matters in numeric things. They'll do numbers. They do tabulation, but mostly when you get qualitative reporting, what you get is a sort of presentation, almost in a sort of documentary fashion, of what the results were, what they looked like, and how they came in. So that's another way of doing communication studies. So that's quantitative methods and qualitative methods. The third way is rhetorical methods, and that's, of course, where we are focused. So rhetorical methods are looking very much to understand how a rhetorical text works. They want nuts and bolts about what's happening inside the text so that meaning gets communicated. Now, remember, a text, a rhetorical artifact, is for us pretty broad. I mean, we're talking about editorials in newspapers, sure. We're talking about speeches given at conventions, absolutely. We're talking about State of the Union addresses by the president, sure, of course. We're talking about, however, also advertising. We're talking about monuments that are put up in public spaces. We're talking about architecture, how space is used to communicate certain ideas. When you walk into certain buildings, you walk into the Supreme Court, or you walk into the Capitol in Washington, D.C., space is being used there in a very rhetorical fashion. That is, in a fashion designed to help you, urge you, nudge you, lead you toward a certain kind of response, a certain sense of what matters and what doesn't matter, what's valuable and what's not valuable, what's important and not important here. So rhetorical methods are looking to understand a rhetorical text or a rhetorical artifact in terms of how it's working. But hold in mind, rhetorical text, rhetorical artifact, we're using those very broadly. And that leads us to this idea of trying to explore exactly how rhetoric, and we haven't really gotten around to defining rhetoric yet. Well, we're going to get there. Okay, we've got another set of lessons, and we're going to unpack rhetoric in the same way we're sort of unpacking criticism. But right now, just think of rhetoric as something designed to move us along. And so rhetoric, one of the things that rhetoric does is it tries to figure out, it asks what the relationship is between logos. Logos is a Greek word again. Logos means a thought, an idea, a reason, evidence for something, an argument. It also means, literally, it means a word. And so we're trying to figure out the relationship between the word that is out there, the words, the language that we use, and reality. How are those two related? So what's the relationship between texts and life? How do those come together? Now that's a big question. And it's not a question that you necessarily are going to answer every time you do a bit of rhetorical criticism, but in the background of what goes on inside of rhetoric, we need to recognize that there is this larger question. How do words, how does language, how do texts function and operate and cooperate in this thing we call life, and how do they all fit together in that way? So that's the question that we're going to raise. Now, inside rhetoric, there are many, many methods. Rhetoric was, for a long time, dominated by a single method called the Neo-Aristotelian method. And the Neo-Aristotelian method is often made fun of, and justly so. It was a relatively shallow, relatively not very valuable methodology in rhetorical criticism, but it very much dominated the field of rhetorical criticism in the early 20th century. And in about 1965, Neo-Aristotelian criticism collapses because of a really it collapses for many reasons, but sort of the coup d'etat was a book called Rhetorical Criticism by a guy named Black, and he writes and he says, look, this method doesn't really tell us anything important. I mean, it gives us basically just the simplest idea of data. Who was speaking, where were they, how long did they talk, did they get, how long was the applause? There's nothing in here that could really get us to anything significant or important. It was all really simple baseline stuff. In 1965, that method collapsed entirely. That method, by the way, is not to be confused with classical analysis, which we still use today and is very much also rooted in Aristotle, but it's rooted in a much deeper, richer, more nuanced understanding of Aristotle. So classical analysis is not Neo-Aristotelian analysis, all right? But what happened is once Neo-Aristotelian analysis falls, what you end up with is this vacuum in the field, and a number of people rush to try and fill that vacuum to provide us with, in essence, a series of, a single method that could replace Neo-Aristotelian criticism. And very quickly, we decided early on, that's not what we want. Because what we're dealing with here is too rich, it's too nuanced, it's too big, it's too complex for any single method. So let's bring them in. If you got a method, you got an idea, bring your method, bring your idea into the front, to the fore, and let's try it out. And let's see if we can learn something about how messages work from that method, using that particular way of seeing how a text is put together. So we have all kinds of methods in rhetorical criticism today, and over the course of this class, you're going to learn many, many of these methods, or at least you're going to become acquainted with many, many of these lessons here. Or these methods here in the lessons that are coming up. So we'll look at cluster analysis, we'll look at ideological criticism, we're going to look at feminist criticism and Bitzer and close reading and Perlman and Ulbricht-Saiteka. We're going to touch on those and many others over the course of the semester. So method is where we're focused right now, and we know that method basically is a set of step-by-step instructions for exploring some kind of communication phenomenon. It provides some kind of insight, basically information about that communication event, about how this rhetorical text is working. The results of that method, however, have to be subjected to interpretation. Knowing how something works doesn't help us. I mean, if you can explain how the combustion engine works in a car, that's great, and that's really valuable. But even once we know that, we do not know where that car is going. We have to figure out why this engine is being used in this way, and what direction is the vehicle going, and how fast is it going to try to get us there. And so we have all these questions that still remain even once we get this sense of how the message itself is organized, right? We know where we're going to start. We see how that's developed. We can see our three main lines of reasoning that are going to get us to our conclusion and draw us to this thesis, this thing that the author wants us to accept. So getting all that in front of us, we have the results of our method. That's great. But that result, that plan of how the message is working, does not in the end stand alone. The results have to be interpreted. So we have to take those results that we have and we have to place them in front of us. And you remember, we have to look at them. We have to view them. Interpretation comes from theoreo, from theory. From theoreo means I look at, I see. So to look at something and to study it, to consider it, to reflect on it, that is how we're going to formulate our interpretation. It's going to be guided, just like understanding and discovering how this message was laid out here, what its parts and pieces are, what the transitions are between the parts and pieces, what's the goal, where does it start, how does it draw me in, what are the main ideas, how are they developed to become evidence that will lead me to a sense that I really need to act and embrace this idea. All of that's there. Once I get that, we have to, once that's in front of us, so that's the results of method right there. That tells us how this thing worked. But even so, we're now going to interpret that meaning, and we're going to interpret it from the point of view that we bring to this event. Now, we have to be careful here. We've got to be very, very cautious, because in the end, even though it is absolutely true that essentially theoreo is our way of seeing this, it's a way of looking intently, purposefully. It's the perspective we bring as we contemplate, think about, reflect deeply on what we have seen from our method. So our method gives us this structure. What we're going to do is we're going to look at it. Obviously, we're going to look at it from a point of view. But the danger we have at this point is we have to be very careful that we do not think of this theory, my perspective, as something more than it is in criticism. So theory is not at this moment, when we get the results of our method in front of us and we're about to move to interpretation. Theory does not give me permission to simply turn the discussion, my critical paper, into an argument with the author. Even though I'm bringing my perspective, it's not that I'm here to argue for my perspective. That's the crucial difference. Of course, I'm going to see things from a certain point of view, but I'm not here to argue that my point of view, my perspective, the way I see it, is something that you should take over and above what this author has been saying. So we're not here as critics, even at this point when we are doing this interpretation. Even in interpretation, we're not here to suddenly make a transition and begin writing editorials. We're not here to think about arguing with and making sure that everybody knows that this author is wrong and I'm right, or that this author is really, really right and we're here to champion them. Even at this point, the critic does not take sides. The critic does not say, the judgments we make are judgments about whether or not the message works, not whether or not this was a good author, or not whether or not this is a good idea. We say these lines of reasoning led strongly to the conclusion. Now that's a judgment. That's an interpretation of the event. Or the line of reasoning that we saw, while good in themselves, was so disorganized and seemed to be so interactive that we never really got to the conclusion. Okay, that's an interpretation too. So we're getting to a place where we want to emphasize that our interpretation is not self-expression. It is an interpretation about the communication event. That's what you're interpreting. It's not an invitation to self-expression. Now, there are basically two fundamental, overarching ways of doing criticism inside communication studies. The two ways are called the constitutive, or sometimes called the constructive, or sometimes called the subjectivist, and the mimetic, sometimes called the objectivist theory. They have a number of different names, but these are the two basic schools: the constitutive and the mimetic. Your theory will come from one of these perspectives, almost certainly. Okay, so your view, your perspective about what is going on here is going to be rooted in one of those two theories. It's going to be constitutive, or it's going to be mimetic. One of the two. Now, so let's take a look very briefly at the large sense here. And we're not going into a huge amount of depth here, but we want to just sort of give you a sense of how these two differ from each other. The constitutive view, the constitutive theory, is a perspective that says, in essence, social reality is linguistically constructed. That's the big fancy way of saying it. It's the way of saying, look, the world we live in, its social realities are built by us. They are constructed by us. They are put together by us. We are the ones who are doing this, and it is our responsibility to put it together in the way we want. In the way that's going to work, and it's going to be the best possible way we can do it. So the constitutive theory thinks of language essentially as a way to build things. That's what language is. Language is a set, words function to basically create social senses of reality. So when we talk about justice, for example, that's Aristotle and Plato's big go-to category. So when we talk about justice, it's not that justice is some thing that's out there. It's that you and I are going to decide what just means. What does it mean to have justice in the world? And we're going to set out with our language to try and draw other people into our perspective about what constitutes justice. And we're going to try and assemble the definition that serves our ideals and our purposes about what constitutes justice. Now, that's the constitutive view. That's the view that says we're going to build with words a kind of social order that's going to evolve with us and adapt and adjust. Now, there are strengths to that view. There are weaknesses to that view. We'll talk about those just in a little bit more depth and detail as we move ahead in these lessons. But right now, if you get this idea, the basic idea that by talking, by speaking, by leaning on one another and nudging one another in one direction or another, we are basically constructing, building the kind of social space that we want and that we're comfortable with. Now, the constitutive view is set against the mimetic view. And the mimetic view is very, very different. What the mimetic view does is it says, mimetic is again, a Greek word, and it means to imitate or reflect. It gives us the word mimic in English, right? So the mimetic view is different. The mimetic view says, look, the things we think of as social realities, good, bad, right, wrong, just, unjust, these things are not ours for the taking. These things exist. They are out here like mountains or like trees or a castle. They're as real as those things. They're as real as material reality. And I can't go up to, in the mimetic view, they would say, I can't go up to a mountain and convince it to turn into a cloud. Okay, I can't go up to a mountain and convince it to lay down and become flat. So this mountain is fixed. It's a reality that is there, whether I like it or not, and it has the qualities it has, whether I like it or not. And language operates down here in the lake. Language provides us with a way to sort of talk about these realities, because these realities in the mimetic view that are out here, these real ideas of justice and beauty and goodness and all of that. Those realities are not realities I can experiment on. They're not part of I can't go out and get you a cup of goodness or 16.3 meters of truth. This is not something I can do because they're not in the world in that way. So they're real. They're as real as the material stuff that make up walls and the ground and mountains and clouds. But that reality is not something that I have access to with my senses. I only have access to it with my intellect. And so when I contemplate and I think about how communication is working, language works by creating a sort of reflection that describes this reality as best we can given the sort of fluid, fluctuating circumstances that are all around us. The reflection is never, of course, perfect, but it gets us pretty close, and we can begin to get a sense through the language, through our use of words, we can get a sense of what the world ought to look like. And so these fixed realities are in fact what language is supposed to move us toward. So that's the mimetic view. Very different from the constitutive view. In the constitutive view, there's certainly overlap here, and as I say, we'll look at both of these in a little bit more depth, explain them a little bit more as we move ahead. But right now, it's enough to know that there's the constitutive view that says we build our own reality. We decide what the word just means, what justice is, and then we try to use our language to build that understanding of justice in the world. But we have made that choice. And the other vision, the mimetic vision, is no, justice is a fixed reality like this mountain here, and we use our words to try our best to sort of describe that reality and push the world toward imitating, that's where we get the word mimetic, toward mimicking or imitating that high real justice that's out there somewhere. So those are the two basic theories of communication. You're building reality with language, or you're using your language to try and show and reveal a reality that's already fixed and out there somewhere. Okay, we're not going any further into that rabbit hole today, so we can pull back from there, and we can say, all right, so that's criticism. Criticism basically is to look at what's in front of you, see it, see what's there, look again, see more. Every time you look, every time you follow your method, you follow your set of directions, you're going to see more and more and more. You're going to see similarities. You're going to see differences. You need to keep doing that. Keep doing the criticism. And when you get an understanding of that artifact that's in front of you, then you're in a position where you can move on to contemplate, to reflect deeply on that artifact, and see and understand, and then eventually to interpret more and more what it is that is happening here in this communication event. So that wraps up our first set of lessons. We'll be moving on to the idea of rhetoric in our next set of lessons.